The acrid scent of burning rubber, sharp and alien in the manicured air of Willow Creek Estates, was the first discordant note. Then the sickening crunch of metal against something yielding, a sound that spoke of minor violence, yet felt like a profound violation in this placid Saturday afternoon hum. Amelia Thorne recently ascended to the hard-won office of District Attorney felt an involuntary clench in her stomach, her knuckles whitening on the steering wheel of her sensible sedan. She'd been anticipating a quiet, restorative visit with her mother Eleanor, a longtime resident of this meticulously landscaped, supposedly serene enclave. The sounds of discord, raw and visceral, were an aberration, a tear in the carefully woven fabric of manufactured tranquility. Then came the voices, one high-pitched with a mixture of fear and indignation, the other a guttural, bullying roar of aggression that made the hairs on Amelia's arms stand on end. Peering through her windshield, her lawyer's mind already cataloging details, Amelia saw it. A uniformed security guard, his body language, a study in belligerent, unchecked power, had an elderly man splayed unnaturally painfully over the hood of a gleaming, now visibly dented, silver sedan. The older man's silver hair was askew, his face a mask of disbelief pain and a dawning, humiliated outrage. One leg, Amelia noticed with a sharp, pained intake of breath, was clearly a prosthetic, twisted at an awkward, unnatural angle beneath him. You think you can assault an officer of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Old man, the guard whose name tag read K. Jenkins, in stark, aggressive block letters, snarled, his spittle flying. You're going down for this resisting arrest assault on a security officer, reckless endangerment, the whole 9 yards. We'll see how you like explaining this to President Miller. Amelia's heart plummeted a cold stone in her chest. She knew that man. It was Arthur Abernathy, a name spoken with quiet reverence and affection in her mother's many conversations about Willow Creek. He was a decorated Korean War veteran, a widower known for his prize-winning roses and his gentle, almost shy demeanor. He was the kind of man who'd leave anonymous bags of tomatoes from his garden on neighbors' doorsteps. The idea of him assaulting anyone, let alone this brute of a guard who outweighed him by a good 70 pounds, was beyond preposterous. This wasn't just an altercation. It was an outrage, a gross abuse of power playing out on a sun-dappled suburban street. Her own car glided to a halt, almost of its own accord, pulling neatly to the curb. The instincts honed by years in the courtroom, the relentless pursuit of facts, the unwavering commitment to justice that had been the bedrock of her recent hard-fought campaign, surged to the forefront, overriding any personal inclination to simply drive on and avoid involvement. She exited her vehicle, the click of her sensible heels on the pristine asphalt, a surprisingly loud counterpoint to the thudding in her chest. Officer Amelia called out her voice, cutting through the charged, humid air with a calm, steely precision that belied the fury simmering beneath her professional exterior. What precisely is transpiring here, Jenkins? A thick-set man whose dark blue uniform seemed strained to its limits across his broad chest and bulging biceps turned his eyes, small, hard, and unintelligent, fixing on her with unconcealed annoyance and a hint of predatory assessment. Mind your own business, lady. This is official HOA security business. This delinquent attempted to run me down with his vehicle. He's a menace. His lip curled as he gestured contemptuously at Mr. Abernathy, who was now struggling to push himself upright. Mr. Abernathy, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, managed to lever himself up slightly, his face pale, but his eyes blazing with a desperate, indignant fire. That is an unmitigated, outrageous falsehood. He gasped, his voice trembling but clear. I was cautiously backing out of my own driveway. This individual materialized directly behind my vehicle, as if from nowhere. I barely tapped him, it was he who threw himself against my car. His gaze found Amelia's a flicker of desperate recognition, a fragile tendril of hope passing between them. He knew of her new position. He'd even attended one of her campaign town halls with Eleanor. Amelia's attention, however, remained locked on Jenkins, her expression unreadable. I observed the entire sequence of events from my vehicle, Officer Jenkins. She stated her tone cool, level, and unwavering. She had indeed rounded the corner just in time to see Jenkins stride purposefully into the path of the slowly reversing car. Mr. Abernathy was proceeding with extreme caution, at a speed barely above idle. You, on the other hand, appeared to intentionally and rather dramatically place yourself in his path, creating this very incident. Each word was chosen with deliberate care, each syllable carrying an implicit, unyielding challenge. Jenkins let out a short, derisive, humorless laugh. Who are you, his high-priced lawyer, some bleeding heart from out of town, come to stir up trouble? Just move along, lady, before you obstruct justice, too. This is Willow Creek business, and we handle our own. He gave Mr. Abernathy's arm a vicious, deliberate twist, eliciting a pained grunt and a renewed wave of color, flooding the older man's face. The cruelty was blatant, almost performative, as if intended for an audience. Actually, Amelia replied, her voice dropping, slightly imbued now with the full, unmistakable authority of her office, an authority she rarely had to invoke so directly. I am Amelia Thorne, the district attorney for this county. And what I am currently witnessing, Officer Jenkins, appears to be the unlawful restraint of a senior citizen, aggravated assault, the possible malicious damage to private property, and potentially the fabrication of an official report to cover your actions. She reached into her handbag, her movements unhurried but purposeful, and retrieved the familiar leather wallet containing her badge. She flipped it open, the polished gold shield, catching the afternoon sun, a small, potent symbol of the law. The transformation in Jenkins was instantaneous and dramatic, almost comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. The florid, angry color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, unhealthy gray. His aggressive, puffed-up stance wilted like a punctured balloon, the sneer dissolving into an expression of stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. He released Mr. Abernathy's arm as if the old man's flesh had suddenly become molten. District attorney. He stammered the word, catching in his throat, his eyes darting nervously from the badge to Amelia's implacable face. I had no idea, ma'am. No idea at all. Evidently not. Amelia said, her eyes, the color of gathering storm clouds, narrowed. Now, Officer Jenkins, I suggest you begin by providing a meticulously truthful and comprehensive account of the events leading to this arrest. And be aware every word you utter from this moment forward will be subject to intense scrutiny and verification. You might also want to consider your right to counsel. The quiet, tree-lined street, moments before a backdrop for manicured suburban ennui, was now the epicenter of a rapidly escalating drama, the opening salvo in a battle Amelia hadn't sought, but would now with grim determination see through to its end. The undercurrents of this seemingly placid community, she sensed with a sudden, chilling certainty, ran far deeper and darker than the pristine, flower-bordered surfaces suggested. Arthur Abernathy's life in Willow Creek Estates had, until that calamitous Saturday afternoon, been a carefully cultivated haven of peace, a quiet bulwark against the encroaching loneliness of his later years. A widower of 5 years, the loss of his beloved Clara, still a quiet, persistent ache in his heart, he had found solace in the rhythms of his small, meticulously tended garden, the scent of upturned earth and blooming roses, a daily balm to his soul. His modest bungalow number 17, Primrose Lane, was a testament to a life lived with order, quiet pride, and a deep appreciation for simple beauty. Mornings were for tending his prize-winning peace roses, their delicate apricot-to-blush hue, a constant, gentle reminder of Clara's favorite color, and for his correspondence with other veterans from his old unit. Afternoons were for reading predominantly military history and biographies, the campaigns of long-dead generals, and the struggles of historical figures, a strangely comforting counterpoint to the vivid, often intrusive memories of his own service in the frozen, unforgiving hills of Korea. The shrapnel that had claimed part of his left leg decades ago had left him with a permanent limp and a reliance on a sophisticated but often cumbersome prosthesis, but it had never managed to dent his quiet dignity, his keen intellect, or his wry, understated sense of humor. He was by all accounts a good neighbor, a man who offered a quiet nod over the fence, a shared pleasantry about the unpredictable weather, a repository of local history, and gardening tips for those who cared to listen. He was, in short, the kind of unassuming, decent man who formed the quiet backbone of any true community. Karen Miller, on the other hand, wielded her presidency of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association like a medieval scepter, or perhaps more accurately, a finely tuned instrument of control. In her late 50s, perpetually coiffed in a severe lacquered helmet of blonde hair, her expensive designer sportswear chosen with an eye for intimidation and status, rather than actual comfort or practicality, she patrolled the community in her golf cart with an air of proprietary, almost obsessive vigilance. When she had first been elected 3 years prior on a platform of restoring Willow Creek's prestige, her promises of maintaining property values, enhancing security, and rigorously enforcing community standards had been met with general approval, even relief, by many residents. Willow Creek was, after all, a community that prided itself on its aesthetic uniformity, its meticulously maintained landscapes, and its perceived exclusivity. Karen, a widow herself, had apparently suffered a devastating financial setback years earlier, a business bankruptcy involving her late husband that had reportedly wiped out their considerable fortune and forced her into a period of significant hardship. She rarely spoke of it, but Eleanor Thorne had pieced together fragments from older residents who remembered Karen's arrival in Willow Creek, initially in a much smaller rental property, before she somehow managed to acquire her current larger home, and then, with astonishing speed, ascend to the HOA presidency. This past trauma Amelia suspected might have fueled an almost pathological need for control, for order, for the accumulation of power, however petty its domain. Karen's initial efficiency as HOA president had over time curdled into a rigid, almost fanatical adherence to a rulebook that seemed to expand and shift according to her whims and personal vendettas. Her pronouncements, often delivered with a saccharine, condescending smile that never quite reached her cold, assessing eyes, became de facto law. Minor infractions. A slightly overgrown hedge a garbage can left out an hour too long after pickup, a child's brightly colored bicycle momentarily abandoned on a front lawn, the wrong shade of beige for window trim, were met with sharply worded, subtly threatening notices, escalating fines that seemed disproportionate to the offense, and public shamings at the monthly HOA meetings where Karen presided like a queen holding court. A palpable tension, an undercurrent of fear and resentment, had begun to settle over Willow Creek, a layer of anxiety beneath the polished, smiling veneer. Residents whispered their grievances in hushed tones in the supermarket aisles or during clandestine coffee clatches, fearful of attracting Karen's formidable, vindictive wrath. Amelia Thorne's visits to her mother Eleanor were usually a cherished respite from the grueling, often demoralizing demands of the district attorney's office. Eleanor, a pragmatic and fiercely independent woman in her late 70s, a retired librarian with a keen mind and a no-nonsense attitude, cherished her life in Willow Creek for its surface tranquility, its well-maintained amenities, and the readily available social activities. Amelia, having clawed her way through a top-tier law school on scholarships and then up the ranks of the prosecutor's office, had recently achieved her long-held ambition of becoming district attorney, her victory fueled by a deep-seated belief in fairness, a palpable weariness with the old guard's cronyism and complacency, and a promise to bring a new era of accountability to the county. She was keenly aware of the power she now wielded, the immense responsibility that came with it, and the political enemies she had made along the way. That particular Saturday, she had been looking forward to nothing more complicated than a cup of her mother's strong tea, a slice of lemon cake, and Eleanor's slightly tart but invariably insightful observations on local politics and the latest neighborhood gossip. The violent, unjustified arrest of Mr. Abernathy, witnessed in all its ugly bullying detail, was therefore not just a disturbing breach of the peace, it was a personal affront, a desecration of the very values Amelia had sworn to uphold. Karen Miller's shadow loomed large over Willow Creek, her influence seemingly pervasive. Amelia knew, with a chilling certainty, that holding Officer Jenkins accountable for his thuggery would inevitably mean confronting the woman who had by all accounts hired, empowered, and likely directed him. This was not just about one rogue guard. This was about a systemic abuse of power within the HOA. As Jenkins, now thoroughly deflated and sweating profusely despite the mild afternoon, attempted to reconstruct his narrative under Amelia's unwavering gaze, his lies became increasingly transparent, almost laughably so. He claimed Mr. Abernathy had been speeding recklessly down his own short driveway, that he had swerved erratically, as if intoxicated, that Jenkins, in a feat of heroic agility, had been forced to leap to safety, heroically, preventing a more serious, perhaps even fatal incident. Amelia listened with a practiced icy patience, her expression unreadable, her mind dissecting his clumsy fabrications. When he finally stumbled to a halt, licking his dry lips, she calmly, but with an unmistakable edge of steel in her voice, requested the security camera footage from the HOA guardhouse at the main entrance, which she knew from previous visits had a clear line of sight covering the entrance to Mr. Abernathy's cul-de-sac. Jenkins' eyes darted nervously towards the small, discreet camera mounted on a nearby decorative lamppost, then back to Amelia's implacable face. The system's a bit unreliable, ma'am," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Temperamental. Sometimes it records, sometimes it doesn't. Budget cuts, you know." "Then let us hope today is one of its more reliable and conscientious days." Officer Jenkins Amelia stated, already dialing the non-emergency line for the local police department on her cell phone. She requested a uniformed officer to secure the potential evidence, formally process Jenkins, and take Mr. Abernathy's statement. The arrival of a marked patrol car a few minutes later, its presence official, calm and undeniable, seemed to solidify the reality of Jenkins' rapidly deteriorating predicament. Under the watchful eye of the responding patrol officer, a young competent woman named Officer Davies, and a visibly shaken but resolute Mr. Abernathy. The footage was retrieved from the guardhouse DVR. The grainy, time-stamped images played out on a small monitor in the cramped guardhouse, telling a story starkly damningly different from Jenkins' desperate self-serving fabrications. Mr. Abernathy's silver sedan was shown inching backward from his driveway at a snail's pace, the brake lights clearly visible. Jenkins, who had been idly observing traffic from further down the street, apparently bored, was then seen striding purposefully, almost aggressively, towards the slowly moving car. Then, with what could only be described as deliberate, almost theatrical timing, he stepped directly behind the vehicle, just as Mr. Abernathy began to turn his wheel to enter the street. The subsequent impact was barely a nudge, a gentle tap. Jenkins' theatrical stagger, his clutch of his leg, and his furious, immediate accusations followed a clear, undeniable performance for an unseen audience, or perhaps Amelia suspected with a growing unease for the specific benefit of his patron, Karen Miller. A collective gasp, quickly stifled, went through the small group of residents who had cautiously gathered at a safe distance, drawn by the commotion and the arrival of the police. The truth, raw and unadorned on the video screen, was damning. Amelia turned to Jenkins, her expression grim, her patience exhausted. "Officer Jenkins," she announced, her voice resonating with the full cold weight of her office, "based on this clear video evidence, Mr. Abernathy's sworn testimony, and my own direct observations, I am placing you under arrest for filing a false police report assault and unlawful detention. You have the right to remain silent." As she calmly and clearly recited his Miranda rights, the sight of the burly, formerly swaggering security guard being expertly handcuffed by Officer Davies and led shoulders slumped to the waiting patrol car sent a palpable wave of shock, followed by a dawning, almost fearful sense of vindication through the onlookers. The meticulously kept, often suffocating peace of Willow Creek Estates had been irrevocably shattered, and in its place, a far more complex, uncomfortable, and potentially dangerous reality was beginning to surface. The days that followed were a maelstrom of legal proceedings, hushed neighborhood meetings, and burgeoning community unrest. Amelia, while meticulously careful to maintain the professional detachment required of her office and avoid any appearance of a conflict of interest, found herself increasingly disturbed by the insidious tendrils of fear, intimidation, and a strange, cult-like loyalty that seemed to emanate from the HOA, specifically from its president, Karen Miller. Her mother, Eleanor, usually stoic and unflappable, relayed stories of hushed, anxious conversations among residents, of nervous glances exchanged over meticulously trimmed hedges, and of a pervasive, almost palpable unease that had settled over Willow Creek like a toxic, invisible miasma. Some residents, Eleanor reported, were actually defending Jenkins, echoing Karen Miller's narrative that Mr. Abernathy was a troublemaker who didn't respect HOA authority. This division within the community was a worrying new development. The initial investigation into Jenkins' employment history and his conduct within Willow Creek yielded its first disturbing fruit. He wasn't merely an overzealous guard, he was a man with a documented pattern of aggressive behavior and a history of complaints. 2 previous security firms had terminated his employment following multiple, substantiated complaints of excessive force, verbal abuse, and intimidation. Yet he had been hired by Willow Creek's security contractor, a firm called Ironclad Security, and specifically assigned to their community. Digging deeper, Amelia assigned one of her best investigators to look into Ironclad and its contracts. She discovered that Karen Miller had personally championed Jenkins' assignment to Willow Creek, overriding the initial concerns voiced by at least 2 other HOA board members who had found his references, or lack thereof, troubling during a review of Ironclad's personnel roster. One of these board members, a quiet retired accountant named George Findley, reluctantly admitted to Amelia during a discreet, off-the-record interview that Karen had been extremely insistent, implying that Jenkins was exactly the kind of no-nonsense, proactive individual Willow Creek needed to maintain its high standards and deal with recalcitrant elements. Findley, Amelia noted, seemed nervous, almost apologetic, but also strangely loyal to Karen, praising her strong leadership, even as he described her overbearing tactics. This painted a more sinister picture. Jenkins wasn't just a rogue actor. He was an instrument, perhaps even a favored protege of Karen's autocratic will. Then came the incident with Mrs. Agnes Gable, a gentle, beloved soul in her early 80s, whose Alzheimer's had begun to cast longer, more frequent, and unpredictable shadows over her days. One cool Tuesday evening, disoriented and apparently believing she was late for a church choir practice from her youth some 60 years prior, Mrs. Gable had wandered out of the main gates of Willow Creek, her familiar pink housecoat flapping in the cool evening breeze. She was found confused, but physically unharmed, by a passing motorist about a mile down the road, trying to catch a bus that no longer ran. Several residents, including a frantic Eleanor Thorne, had quickly organized a search party and were immensely relieved by her safe return. Their relief, however, turned to cold outrage when Karen Miller, instead of expressing even a shred of human concern or compassion, immediately issued a formal, sharply worded warning to Mrs. Gable's son Tom, a quiet, unassuming middle-aged man who lived with and devotedly cared for his ailing mother. In her official HOA letter, Karen cited a vaguely worded, recently amended HOA bylaw about ensuring residents do not pose a liability or create public disturbances outside community grounds. She threatened Tom with a hefty, crippling fine and more chillingly initiated formal HOA proceedings to have Mrs. Gable assessed by an independent medical professional of Karen's choosing naturally for her continued suitability to reside in Willow Creek, implying she might try to force her removal from her own home. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it was breathtaking. Tom Gable, a quiet, hard-working man already burdened with the immense emotional, physical, and financial stress of his mother's progressive illness, was distraught, terrified of losing their home. Eleanor, incandescent with a fury Amelia had rarely witnessed, called her immediately. "This isn't about rules," Amelia Eleanor had said, her voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. "This isn't about community standards or liability. This is about pure, unadulterated cruelty. This is Karen trying to purge anyone she deems imperfect, anyone who doesn't fit her sterile vision from her little kingdom. She wants this place to be a showroom, not a community of human beings." Amelia, leveraging her position as DA, but treading carefully to avoid accusations of overreach, made a direct, unscheduled call to Karen Miller. Her intervention was swift, professional, and decisive. She pointed out the potential legal ramifications of discriminating against an elderly resident with a documented medical condition, referencing fair housing laws and disability protections. She also subtly reminded Karen of the county's robust adult protective services and the legal obligation to report suspected elder abuse or neglect, including financial exploitation or undue pressure. Karen, faced with the DA's direct informed involvement, had audibly bristled, but ultimately backed down on the immediate threat of assessment and removal, though not without a veiled, venomous threat about Amelia grossly overstepping her official bounds and improperly interfering in private community matters. Karen had also chillingly added, "You'll find, Ms. Thorne, that those who poke their noses into affairs that don't concern them often regret it. Reputations can be fragile things." The threat, though indirect, was unmistakable. Karen was not just a petty tyrant. She was dangerous and vindictive. The incident, however, served as a stark illustration of Karen's callousness and further emboldened a small but growing faction of residents who were tired of her oppressive reign. Whispers grew louder, morphing into tentative, then more confident conversations in driveways over garden fences and via encrypted messaging apps. Amelia's investigation, initially focused solely on the assault charges against Jenkins, now broadened with extreme caution and appropriate firewalls to avoid any conflict of interest to encompass the entire pattern of conduct and potential malfeasance within the Willow Creek HOA under Karen Miller's increasingly autocratic stewardship. She assigned a bright, tenacious, and discreet junior prosecutor from her white-collar crime division, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who had no personal connection to Willow Creek, to meticulously review publicly available HOA meeting minutes, complaint logs obtained through resident cooperation and vendor contracts that were by law matters of HOA record. The stories that emerged, corroborated by multiple residents who were now cautiously willing to speak, were depressingly consistent, a pattern of arbitrary fines for nonsensical or selectively enforced infractions. Mr. Henderson's perfectly healthy ancient oak tree being suddenly declared a potential hazard to underground utilities requiring expensive, immediate removal by a specific landscaping company Karen happened to recommend. Mrs. Rodriguez's new previously HOA-approved fence paint being deemed fractionally too vibrant and out of harmony with the community's aesthetic palette immediately after Mrs. Rodriguez had a minor public disagreement with Karen over guest parking rules. There were numerous credible tales of verbal abuse during HOA meetings, of residents being belittled, dismissed, and publicly humiliated if they dared to question Karen's edicts or financial decisions. The atmosphere she had cultivated was one of pervasive fear and grudging compliance, where dissent was quashed with ruthless, smiling efficiency. Some residents even reported subtle acts of vandalism, slashed tires, poisoned rose bushes, occurring shortly after they had challenged Karen, though nothing could be definitively proven. The real twist, the one that shifted the investigation from abuse of power and intimidation into a far more serious criminal conspiracy, came not from the HOA's overt actions, but from its carefully concealed finances. Sarah Chen, a veritable bloodhound when it came to financial documents, was poring over reams of HOA financial statements late one Thursday night, her small office illuminated only by the cold glow of her computer screen and fueled by lukewarm, stale coffee. She stumbled upon an anomaly, a recurring significant line item described vaguely as Community Enhancement Fund disbursements to a company called Willow Creek Development Group. The payments were substantial, and Evergreen Solutions, the shell landscaping company from earlier, was listed as a subsidiary. Further investigation revealed that the Willow Creek Development Group was a newly formed LLC, its listed address, a P.O. box, its director a name Alistair Finch, that appeared nowhere else in local records. Cross-referencing payment authorizations with Karen Miller's signature, and then through a carefully obtained subpoena with certain encrypted communications found on HOA computers, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Large sums of HOA money were flowing into the Willow Creek Development Group. But this wasn't simple embezzlement for personal enrichment as initially suspected. The funds were then being used to make targeted below-market offers on properties within Willow Creek owned by elderly or financially vulnerable residents who had often been subjected to a preceding campaign of HOA harassment and fines seemingly designed to make them desperate to sell. The chilling truth began to coalesce. Karen wasn't just stealing. She was instrumental in a predatory scheme, likely orchestrated by this mysterious Alistair Finch, to acquire properties within Willow Creek, cheaply possibly for a larger undisclosed redevelopment plan that would enrich Finch and his hidden partners. Karen's role was to use the HOA's power to soften up the targets, creating the conditions for Finch to swoop in. Her own financial gain was likely a percentage, a payoff for her facilitation. The ruthless campaign against Mrs. Gable, the pressure on Mr. Abernathy. It all clicked into a horrifying larger picture. This wasn't just about a power-hungry HOA president. This was organized, predatory real estate manipulation, potentially involving fraud, coercion, and elder exploitation. The investigation had now escalated into a major criminal conspiracy. Amelia felt a cold knot of anger and disgust tighten in her chest. The betrayal was profound, the scale of the potential wrongdoing staggering. And Karen Miller, the woman who prattled on about community standards and property values, was at the rotten core of it. Amelia knew she was treading on dangerous ground. Alistair Finch, whoever he was, clearly had resources and a willingness to operate in the shadows. The veiled threat Karen had made about Amelia's reputation now seemed more ominous. Her own boss, the county executive, had already quietly questioned her disproportionate focus on a mere HOA dispute, hinting that powerful people with interests in county development were watching. Amelia had pushed back, citing the clear evidence of potential criminal activity, but the pressure was there. She also worried deeply for her mother. Eleanor, now actively involved with a growing resident reform group within Willow Creek, was becoming more vocal in her opposition to Karen. What if Karen, or worse Finch, decided to target Eleanor to pressure Amelia? The thought sent a chill down her spine. The call for a special general meeting of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association gained unstoppable momentum, fueled by hushed outrage, Sarah Chen's meticulously gathered and carefully leaked financial data, and a growing sense of empowerment, fanned by Amelia's discreet but firm support through her mother and other trusted residents like Arthur Abernathy, who had become an unlikely figurehead for the reform movement. The community clubhouse, usually reserved for sedate bridge tournaments and meticulously planned holiday potlucks, was filled to overflowing on the designated evening. The air was thick with a volatile electric mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and a newly uncorked righteous anger that had been simmering suppressed for years. Karen Miller, flanked by her few remaining loyalists. On the board, including a visibly uncomfortable George Findlay, who still seemed to believe Karen was fundamentally misunderstood, presided from a raised table at the front. Her expression was one of bored, contemptuous condescension, as if this unruly gathering were a minor, distasteful inconvenience she would shortly and decisively dispense with. Her perfectly applied crimson lipstick formed a tight moue of distaste as she tapped her diamond-encrusted pen impatiently on a stack of papers. The initial trickle of grievances began hesitantly as residents long cowed by Karen's retaliatory tactics found their courage. Old Mrs. Periwinkle, her voice quavering but resolute. Her small dog, peeking out from her handbag, spoke of being fined repeatedly and threatened with pet removal because her cat Mittens dared to sunbathe on her own enclosed porch, a violation Karen had declared of the no pets visible in common visual areas from any angle rule, a rule that seemed to have been invented on the spot after Mrs. Periwinkle had politely questioned an HOA assessment increase. Then Mr. Davies, the retired aerospace engineer with a precise, deliberate manner, detailed with painstaking accuracy how Karen had personally vetoed his meticulously planned solar panel installation, citing vague aesthetic concerns and potential glare issues, only to approve a nearly identical and in fact larger system for a favored resident, a close friend of Karen's on the board just a month later. His meticulously prepared presentation, complete with dated photographs, architectural renderings, and copies of email correspondence, was met with murmurs of angry agreement and recognition. As more residents found their voice emboldened by those who spoke before them, the trickle became a flood, a torrent of long-suppressed frustrations. Stories poured out of vindictive fines for infractions that were ignored, for others of personal vendettas, pursued under the guise of bylaw enforcement of public humiliations, and condescending dismissals at Karen's hands during HOA meetings if anyone dared to question her pronouncements or financial stewardship. The narrative of a community held hostage by one woman's insatiable ego, her desperate need for control, and her avarice painted itself in vivid, damning, overlapping strokes. Karen's carefully maintained composure began to fray at the edges. Her attempts to interrupt, to dismiss the complaints as minor misunderstandings by a few disgruntled individuals or gross exaggerations by habitual complainers who simply don't appreciate the hard work that goes into maintaining our community's excellence, were met with increasingly vocal, almost mutinous dissent. Her fixed, saccharine smile became a rictus of forced calm that utterly failed to conceal the panic and fury flickering in her cold, calculating eyes. She shot several venomous glances towards Eleanor Thorne, who sat calmly in the front row taking notes. Then Amelia Thorne, present not in her official capacity as the district attorney, but as Eleanor Thorne's concerned daughter and a guest of a resident, requested permission to speak. A sudden, profound hush fell over the crowded, overheated room. All eyes turned to her. Karen's eyes narrowed into slits, a flicker of genuine, visceral alarm, now clearly visible behind her crumbling facade. She could hardly refuse, not in front of this increasingly hostile, emboldened crowd, not without looking even more tyrannical. "Very well, Ms. Thorne," Karen said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness that was sharper than any acid. "Though I must remind everyone that this is a homeowners meeting, and your observations as an outsider are perhaps of limited relevance." Amelia walked to the small, rickety lectern, her demeanor calm, her voice measured, but carrying an undeniable quiet authority that filled the room. She didn't speak of Officer Jenkins or Mrs. Gable's mistreatment. Those were matters for other forums. Instead, she began to lay out with the same forensic precision and clarity she used in a courtroom the complex financial labyrinth that Sarah Chen, with Amelia's guidance, had painstakingly uncovered. She presented enlarged copies of bank statements, invoices from the Phantom Willow Creek Development Group and its subsidiary Evergreen Solutions, and clear, easy-to-understand flowcharts that starkly illustrated the systematic movement of substantial HOA funds into these entities, and then through a series of opaque transactions into accounts that were demonstrably linked to individuals associated with Alistair Finch, and in smaller but significant amounts to Karen Miller herself. She spoke not in complex legalese, but in plain, understandable terms, explaining how the community's hard-earned money entrusted to the HOA for its upkeep, its betterment, its security had been systematically siphoned away, diverted into a predatory scheme designed to defraud its most vulnerable members. She detailed the pattern of harassment, followed by lowball offers, painting a clear picture of a conspiracy. The collective gasp that swept through the clubhouse was like the wind being physically knocked out of the room. Faces already pale with anger turned ashen with shock and betrayal as they looked from Amelia's damning evidence to Karen Miller, whose face had gone from a sickly pale to a ghastly shade of mottled gray. She leaped to her feet, knocking over her water glass, her voice no longer controlled, but shrill, cracking with desperation. "Lies. These are all outrageous, malicious lies, a baseless conspiracy concocted by disgruntled, jealous people and an ambitious, interfering prosecutor. I have served this community faithfully. I have protected your property values. This is slander. I will sue every single one of you." But her frantic protestations, her wild accusations, were drowned out by a rising tide of raw, unadulterated outrage from the assembled residents. The evidence was too clear, too meticulous, too damning. The carefully constructed facade of Karen Miller, the benevolent dictator, the efficient manager, the protector of Willow Creek's prestige, crumbled into dust, revealing the grasping, deceitful, predatory woman beneath. Just as the chaos reached its peak, as residents surged towards the dais, shouting questions and accusations, the main clubhouse doors opened, and two uniformed police officers, accompanied by a plainclothes detective Amelia had alerted prior to the meeting, acting on a sealed warrant obtained that afternoon, based on Sarah Chen's evidence, stepped calmly and purposefully inside. The detective, a seasoned professional named Washington, approached the table where Karen Miller stood, trembling with fury and fear. Karen Miller. Detective Washington stated, his voice calm but firm, carrying easily over the din, "You are under arrest for multiple counts of embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." The sight of Karen Miller, her face a mask of stunned disbelief and incandescent rage, being read her Miranda rights, and then escorted out of the clubhouse in handcuffs. Her shrill protests about political persecution and character assassination echoing behind her was a moment of profound, almost surreal catharsis for the long-suffering residents of Willow Creek Estates. The reign of terror, the gilded cage she had constructed, was finally irrevocably over. In the immediate aftermath, a sense of collective shell shock gave way to a quiet, grim determination. Karen Miller was swiftly suspended from all HOA duties, her personal and known associate assets frozen by court order, pending the outcome of the now sprawling criminal investigation into the Willow Creek Development Group and the activities of the elusive Alistair Finch, who had predictably vanished. An interim HOA board composed of respected, untainted residents like George Finlay, who was genuinely horrified and remorseful at how he had been duped by Karen's manipulations, a newly energized and widely respected Eleanor Thorne, and Arthur Abernathy himself, was appointed to manage the community's affairs and begin the arduous, thankless task of untangling the financial and emotional wreckage Karen and her shadowy associates had left behind. The full extent of the fraudulent scheme, once auditors began their deep dive, was even greater and more insidious than initially suspected, a betrayal that cut deep into the community's trust, its financial stability, and its very sense of self. Officer K. Jenkins, His bravado long gone, his former patron, now facing serious felony charges, found himself with little leverage and no defense. The video footage of his assault on Mr. Abernathy was irrefutable. With Karen Miller no longer in a position to protect or influence him, he quickly accepted a plea bargain offered by Amelia's office, guilty on charges of filing a false report assault and unlawful detention. He received a significant fine, a lengthy probation period with mandatory anger management counseling, and crucially the permanent revocation of his security license statewide, ensuring he would never again be in a position to abuse such authority. His downfall served as a stark public warning about the consequences of unchecked power, even at the lowest levels. The resolution for Willow Creek Estates was not a swift or simple fairy tale ending. It was a gradual, often painful, but ultimately steady process of healing, rebuilding, and reclaiming their community. The special general meeting had been a watershed moment, not just for ousting Karen Miller, but for reigniting a sense of shared ownership, civic responsibility, and cautious optimism among the residents. Town hall meetings, once forums for Karen's dictates and public shamings, became regular occurrences, platforms for genuine, sometimes heated, but ultimately constructive discussion and collaborative decision-making. A new HOA board was democratically elected 6 months later with a clear, overwhelming mandate for transparency, accountability, fiscal responsibility, and above all, fairness and respect. Bylaws were meticulously reviewed, with archaic, ambiguous, and punitive rules being systematically struck down or amended with broad community input. New guidelines were established, focusing on fostering mutual respect, ensuring resident safety, and maintaining community standards through education and cooperation, rather than through fear, intimidation, and arbitrary control. The shadow of Alastair Finch and the Willow Creek Development Group still loomed with ongoing federal investigations into their wider operations, a reminder that the fight against such predatory entities was far from over. The security protocols for Willow Creek underwent a complete and immediate overhaul. The contract with Ironclad Security was terminated. The new security firm hired was vetted extensively by a resident committee, with an emphasis on de-escalation training, community policing principles, thorough psychological screening, and verifiable background checks. Amelia Thorne, leveraging the high-profile nature of the Willow Creek case and the clear need for reform, it highlighted, successfully advocated for, and helped draft stricter county-wide regulations governing private security companies operating in residential communities. These new ordinances included mandatory body cameras for all on-duty guards, standardized training in constitutional rights and conflict resolution, and clearer, more accessible channels for resident complaints and oversight. The ripples of justice, hard-won in Willow Creek, began to spread far beyond its now less gilded gates. Mr. Arthur Abernathy, whose quiet courage and refusal to be intimidated in the face of Jenkins's unprovoked aggression had unknowingly sparked the entire chain of events, found himself an unlikely and somewhat reluctant local hero. He bore the attention with his characteristic humility and grace, though his prize-winning Peace Roses received more admiring visitors and requests for cuttings than ever before. The HOA, under its new leadership, formally and publicly apologized to him for his ordeal, and the community, in a spontaneous, heartwarming gesture, organized a collection not only to repair the dent in his beloved silver sedan, but also to make a substantial donation in his name to his favorite veterans charity. He became a quiet, enduring symbol of resilience, his gentle, steadfast presence, a constant reminder of the simple, decent values the community had fought so hard to reclaim. He confessed to Amelia one afternoon over tea in Eleanor's garden that the incident had brought back some of the old anxieties from his war years, a lingering unease when he saw uniformed figures, a slight tremor in his hands that hadn't been there before. The scars, he admitted, were not always visible. Several months later, a crisp, golden autumn evening found Willow Creek Estates hosting its annual Fall Festival, an event that had been a source of considerable dread and expense under Karen Miller's micromanagement, replete with rigidly enforced themes and mandatory participation fees. Tonight, however, the atmosphere in the clubhouse and spilling out onto the main common green was entirely wonderfully different. Genuine, unforced laughter echoed, children with creatively painted faces chased each other through piles of fallen leaves, and neighbors, many of whom had barely spoken during Karen's reign, chatted easily, sharing food from a communal potluck and stories from their lives. The scent of grilled burgers, hot apple cider, and wood smoke from a safely contained fire pit hung in the air, a comfortable, welcoming, and genuinely festive aroma. Amelia stood with her mother near a brightly lit refreshment table, watching the scene with a warmth that spread through her, a welcome antidote to the cynicism her job so often engendered. Eleanor, a newly minted and highly effective treasurer on the reformed HOA board, positively beamed with pride and a touch of well-earned exhaustion. "It's different, isn't it?" Eleanor remarked, her eyes crinkling at the corners as she surveyed the lively, relaxed scene. "People are actually enjoying themselves. No one's worried about their decorations being regulation length or their potluck dish being sufficiently upscale." Amelia smiled a genuine, tired smile. "It's what a community should be, Mom. Messy, a little chaotic, but real." Just then, Mr. Abernathy approached them, a paper plate laden with a surprisingly large slice of pumpkin pie in his hand, a small, contented smile playing on his lips. He navigated the crowd with a new, subtle confidence. "District Attorney Thorne," he said, his voice imbued with a warmth and respect that went beyond mere politeness. He extended his free hand. "Or should I say, Amelia, I believe, after all we've been through together, we've moved beyond strict formalities." Amelia shook his hand firmly, feeling the wiry strength in his grip. "Arthur, please. It's good to see you looking so well, so at peace." "Thanks to you in no small part, Amelia," he replied, his gaze steady and sincere. "You didn't just restore order here. You restored our faith, our voices. You reminded us that one person standing firmly for what's right, even when it's difficult or unpopular, can make all the difference in the world. And you reminded an old soldier that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not on distant fields, but right here at home, for the heart of one's own community." A wave of profound, quiet satisfaction washed over Amelia Thorne. This was why she did what she did. Not for the accolades, not for the power or the prestige, but for these moments, for the tangible positive difference, justice properly and courageously applied could make in ordinary people's lives. As she and Eleanor later strolled towards the exit, the sound of a local high school band striking up a cheerful, slightly off-key tune behind them, Amelia glanced back at the illuminated clubhouse, no longer a fortress of fear, but a beacon of warmth, activity, and renewed, resilient spirit against the darkening autumn sky. The fight had been arduous, the revelations often ugly and disheartening, but the outcome was a testament to the enduring strength of community when it found its voice and the absolute non-negotiable necessity of holding power at every level accountable. Willow Creek Estates was finally truly beginning to find its peace, a peace earned not through enforced silence and artificial conformity, but through the collective, sometimes messy, but ultimately triumphant voice of its people. The scars remained a permanent reminder of the ordeal, of the darkness that could fester beneath even the most polished surfaces. But they were healing, knitting together, a community that was stronger, wiser, and more vigilant than it had ever been before. And Amelia knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was a victory worth every ounce of the effort, every sleepless night, every political risk. Yet, as she got into her car, she also knew that the battle against greed, corruption, and the abuse of power was never truly over. There would always be other Willow Creeks, other Karen Millers, other Alastair Finches. Her work, she realized with a sigh that was both weary and resolute, was far from done.